What are the steps involved in buying a co-op in New York City? Well, buying a co-op in New York City often gets a bad rap because people hear horror stories about the buying process. However, co-ops make up such a large part of the inventory in New York City that chances are you are going to be looking at co-ops as an option. And if you understand a bit more about the process, and if you're working with someone who really understands the buying process for a co-op, chances are you'll have a pretty smooth transaction. So let's break down those steps and everything you need to know about buying a co-op in New York City. I'm Dewey. I'm your New York City real estate resource. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification button, and let's get started. Now, as I mentioned before, co-ops make up a very large part of the inventory in New York City. In fact, they make up about 85% of all the available inventory in the city. So chances are, unless you're truly focused on buying a condo or a townhome, you're going to be looking at co-ops as an option. So it's good to understand exactly what a co-op is and what you're buying into. We have a number of videos that breaks down exactly what co-ops are, but in short, you aren't buying real property with a co-op. You're buying shares in a shareholder-owned company that owns the building. You then have a proprietary lease that is assigned to those shares that allows you to live within that apartment. So you're buying shares, and there are all sorts of really great benefits to buying into a co-op that we address in other videos. Take a look at those. But in short, you're buying shares. As a result, that company that owns the individual building, it's a shareholder-owned company, so it's owned by the shareholders in the building, the people living in the building, gets to make their own rules. Just like any other business with a board that makes their own rules, that has an operating agreement, it is a company and has certain rules. So every co-op in New York City are going to have their own set of rules. That's why the process can be complicated, because you must understand the kind of rules that apply to the buildings, what your criteria are, and then begin to match those together in order to find a good co-op for you. Now, the first step in buying a co-op really is to assemble your team, and that matches going along with the co-op buying process, because you want to have a team that really understands the unique buying process of co-ops in New York City. Otherwise, you will open yourself up to a lot of issues in your transaction. The first person that you need to have on your side is a real estate agent. You need to have a really great buyer's agent that is representing you, that really understands the co-op buying process, the board application process, and the interview process, so that they can really walk you through every step of the transaction and mitigate the risks that are involved in potential pitfalls in that transaction. So your buyer's agent is much more in New York City than just the person who's going to open a door and say, do you like this apartment and let's buy it? No. Your agent really needs to serve as a consulting partner to you and help you through every step of the co-op buying process. It is very important. Now, the next person you need on your team is a really great real estate attorney. Now, New York is an attorney state, which means that the attorneys deal with all of the contracts. In other markets, agents will put together the contract. They'll negotiate the terms, put together the contract. You'll get it signed really fast, and then you'll move into attorney review. Not so in New York City and in New York State. You must have an attorney form the contract and write up the contract. So your agent is going to negotiate all the terms and then hand that information over to an attorney to start the contract process. You need to have your attorney in place really before you go shopping. Again, assembling your team is very important in this process. Oftentimes, having your attorney in place is a negotiating tool for your agent. I can walk out and I can say, hey, my client is really ready to go. Here's our attorney. And by the way, the seller's agent knows who that attorney is and says, hey, that's a really great attorney. We're not going to have any issues with this transaction. So it's important for you to have that attorney ready to go up front before before you make an offer and really before you go shopping. And the final person that you need on your team if you're planning on financing and carrying a mortgage is a mortgage broker or a bank. Now, this is an extremely important tip. A lot of people come from outside of New York City and want to bring their previous mortgage brokers or their previous relationships with banks to the city, and that's admirable. However, those banks and mortgage brokers do not understand the buying processes in New York City, and often, maybe 99% of the time, cause a lot of issues for the deal. You are better off if you come to New York City and work with someone in New York City who specifically works on co-ops and condos, which most of the brokers here and the banks are very familiar with working on co-ops. That's true even just slightly out of the city, in Long Island or just over in Jersey. The banks and the mortgage brokers do not have the kind of experience needed to deal with co-ops. So I highly suggest that this person originate from New York City and has a wealth of experience dealing with co-ops. And that would complete your primary team, your agent, your attorney, and your mortgage broker. Now, the next thing that you need to do with your agent is consider your finances and budget. Now, I break down those two things because they really are two different things. You have your budget. You have the budget that you want to spend on the apartment, and you have your monthly budget, what you want to spend in terms of maybe your mortgage, if you're carrying a mortgage, and those common charges monthly. You have all that. That's your budget. But with a co-op board gets to set the financial expectations of a shareholder coming into the building. There's a form called the Real Estate Board of New York Financial Statement, which we have potential clients fill out when dealing with a co-op, because it is an extensive reveal of your financial situation. And from that form, we're able to assess if your financial situation will match the financial criteria of the building. Otherwise, you're going to have a very difficult time getting through the board review and the board application. Now, there's no particular set criteria. Every building gets to make their own rules, so they're different from building to building. And some boards really place importance on certain financial aspects while others may not. But in general, boards are looking for a low debt to income ratio. They're looking for liquidity, and they're looking for your ability to be a very sound financial shareholder coming into the building. Because if one shareholder sinks, then it's going to start pulling down all the other shareholders in terms of the maintenance payments and the overall costs for the building. So everyone wants to make sure that a new shareholder is going to be financially secure. You need to work with your agent on that revenue financial statement and really understand what your finances look like against a co-op's financial criteria, and then you have a basis to really start going shopping, understanding what your budget is, but also understanding what your financial profile looks like against any co-op's financial criteria. And finally, if you're planning on carrying a mortgage, then you must get pre-approved before you go shopping. This is very important. In New York City, we will not consider offers without a pre-approval, and because the market is so competitive, you need to get your offer in and get the process going. There's not time to get pre-approved after you've made an offer. Come back to the table and try to convince a selling agent and a seller that you really are serious, and here's the pre-approval now a week later. You must have the pre-approval in hand before you go shopping. Now, your financial criteria to get pre-approved with a bank is going to be different than the financial criteria that the board of a building will require. Those are two separate processes. They will go hand in hand in the board application, and we'll talk about that later. But your board application process is going to ask for a lot more financial information than what even a bank is going to look for. A bank also needs to understand what the down payments are on co-ops. A board gets to set the down payment. So if you're coming to the city and you think, well, I've got a pre-approval from out there in the suburbs and they can say I can put 3% down because I'm on a special kind of FHA or some kind of mortgage like that that's going to help me out and just only require 3% down. That's great. That works beautifully in the suburbs. It does not work in New York City because the boards of each individual building determine how much they want a shareholder to put down to become a shareholder in the company. Generally speaking, that's 20%. Sometimes there's less, 15, maybe 10%. It never goes below 10% down, but 20% is usually the guideline. If you're in a competitive part of New York City, or if buildings really want to, it's not uncommon to see 30% down, 40% down, in some rare cases, even 50% down. So your bank must understand when they're giving you the pre-approval and looking at your finances, what the general down payments are going to be so that your finances work out against any building's criteria. And then finally, the fun part, you are ready to go shopping for your dream home. Once you have assembled your team, once you have considered your budget and your financial criteria, and once you have gotten your pre-approval, if you're carrying a mortgage, then you start your shopping process in earnest. Now, even that needs to have a strategy behind it, because going back to what co-ops are, co-op boards get to make their own rules, and every building is different. So you must work closely with your agent to understand all the criteria. For example, you may be a parent buying for an adult child. Your child is coming to the city for school, and you want them to have an apartment that's going to turn into a home, and perhaps you're going to use it when you come to town to visit your child. That is a very big criteria, because not every building in New York City allows that. You have two points there. You have parents buying for an adult child, and you have possibly the parents using the apartment as a pied-à-terre. Those are two different criteria points that a building must allow in order for you to be a viable candidate to buy into that building. If buildings do not allow certain criteria, you are not going to be able to change that. You are not going to be able to say, well, I want to go ahead and put in an offer on this building because perhaps we can convince them that I'm a great person, perhaps I have beautiful financial criteria there, financial profile. I'm going to be able to convince them to let me buy the way I want to buy. That does not happen. That does not happen in New York City. The boards will simply say no to your application, and you've wasted a lot of time and potentially a lot of money. So you want to make sure that in your search, you have created a strategy with your agent, and a really good buyer's agent is going to help guide you through this part of the process to make sure that you're looking at buildings that are a viable option for you and your needs and your criteria, both on the financial side and on just the desire side in terms of what you want to buy. But also, for example, if you have a pet and your beloved pet is going to be coming with you, there are many boards who do not allow pets in the building. So those are the kinds of criteria that you must consider. And again, you will not be able to change it. So good to know all that criteria and start looking at a very good group of apartments where the buildings are going to match your criteria and you are fairly certain that you're going to be able to purchase into that building. Now, once you have found your potential dream home, we start the negotiating process, and that process, of course, looks very much like a process anywhere in the real estate markets across the US in terms of negotiations. You go back and forth, but I will say that it typically happens pretty fast in New York City. It is not uncommon for us to put in an offer, negotiate a day, and have an accepted offer pretty fast. Our market moves fast, and it is often very competitive. So that's why it is important to have all these things in place and ready to go. Once we negotiate and come to terms, we then create the offer. You want to make sure that you're putting in a very airtight offer. In other words, you want to make sure that you're putting in everything that the seller and the selling agent would need to know about you in order to feel reasonably confident that you're going to be able to pass the board application and the board interview process. That's the most important thing. When I'm representing a seller, it's great if a big offer comes in and it's exciting and the seller is going to get a great price for their apartment. But if we then look at the financial criteria and it's going to be very, very risky to put in front of the board, then we have to consider whether or not we can really accept that offer. So in New York City, an offer is much more than just the price that you're offering and the terms you're offering. We have to consider that financial criteria. We have to consider what will get past the board and the board's interview and go from there in terms of accepting. So you want to create an airtight offer. So that means that you are sharing your offer, you're sharing your pre-approval, and you're sharing your financial profile up front with that selling team, along with some other things that hopefully your agent will guide you through to help them understand that you are going to be a good, strong, viable shareholder candidate buying that apartment. Now, once we have an accepted offer, it is time to hand over all of those terms to our attorney. Again, that happens pretty fast. So if we get an accepted offer the day that we put in the offer, we want to have all that information to the attorney that afternoon or the first thing the next morning, right? So it does happen fast. Here is a great part of the process that is fairly unique to New York City. We don't sign the contract immediately. As I said, agents do not put together your contracts in New York City. The contracts start getting drafted by the attorneys, the buyer attorney and the seller attorney, while we do what's called our due diligence period. During this due diligence period, your attorney is going to get a lot of information to review about the building. That includes, at a minimum, the operating agreement. Remember, you're buying into a company, so it has an operating agreement as an LLC that needs to be reviewed. The board minutes from maybe the past year or so that the attorney can look and see what's being discussed about the building and if there are any assessments coming up or any issues being discussed with the building, or maybe the building's in a lawsuit or something. Heaven forbid, but you want to know about those things. Those things will be in the minutes. The finances for the past 2 years, which are an immense part of due diligence to understand exactly what's going on and to make sure that the building that you're buying into, the company that you're buying into, is financially sound and going to be a good investment for you. Those are just a few things that are included in due diligence. There's others. The attorney will put out a questionnaire to get some information back from the board. They're going to review all of that information, and a really good real estate agent in New York City knows exactly in the paperwork what to look for. They have mitigated a lot of risks and identified a lot of problems, so they know the key areas to really look for, and they're going to then report back to you with all that information. Back to you and your agent, and you and your agent can then discuss your options. If a building looks like that it's really about to have some financial issues but are trying to solve those financial issues, then maybe that's a discussion for you and your agent and attorney to have as to whether or not you want to buy into building at this point. So it's really great because during the due diligence process, if any red flags do come up, you have the option to simply walk away from that offer. Now, once you have decided to sign the contract, in most every contract in New York City, there is an as-is clause. That as-is clause is a little bit different in our terminology against other markets where you're buying, an old fixer-up and you're saying, I'm going to buy that as is. What we're saying in New York City is that you are buying the apartment and you understand what's going on in the building and you're buying that whole situation as is. So once you sign that contract, our contracts in New York City do become a little bit more difficult to get out of because there's not a lot of negotiation, if any, left to be done. You're accepting the terms, you're accepting the apartment and the building situation as is. So you want to make sure that during that due diligence period, you really have asked all of your questions, you've gotten everything answered, your agent and your attorney feel good about the purchase you're making, and then you sign the contract, and we officially have a deal, and we can get started with the rest of the process. Now, once we have a signed contract, we're going to begin two processes simultaneously, assuming you're carrying a mortgage. You're going to start your formal mortgage approval process. That's extremely important to get started immediately because we will also start working on your board application. Now, remember, I talked about the REBNY financial form, the Real Estate Board of New York financial statement. That serves as the basis for the immense application that we're about to go through. Now, oftentimes people think of an application, 2 or 3 pages that you fill out. This is really an application that is a full package with many different sections in it. It can be up to 1,000 pages long. You're going to include a lot of your financial information, bank statements, all of your investments, all of your equity in other real estate. You're going to have referral letters. You're going to have bank letters. You're going to have a lot of information. It takes a really, really good amount of time to gather up all that information, to format it, and make sure that it is going to be correctly submitted to the board. But you should not be shocked at this point in time. You should have already discussed this with your agent in terms of the sheer amount of information that you're going to have to provide to the board for them to review. Does that feel strange? Absolutely. I've been through the buying process myself. Revealing so much personal information to a group of strangers does feel strange, but it is part of the process, and I can guarantee you that if you're working with a good agent, they're going to help you understand that process and why you're being asked for specific information. Very important. If you refuse to give any portion of the information in the application, you will not be approved by a board. They will come back and ask for that information. So you need to be understanding of the fact that you're going to have to provide a lot of information. One of the pieces that is almost always required to finish the board application is the final mortgage approval. Not just the pre-approval, but the whole shebang. The final mortgage approval letter must go into that package before we're able to submit to the board for them to review the application. That is why we say we must start these processes simultaneously. Financing at a minimum usually takes 30 days. This is why you want to be working with someone who really understands co-op so that that process does not get delayed, because if the process gets delayed, now your attorney has to go and ask for extensions in the contract for financing. It starts putting the application in a little bit of jeopardy in terms of timing. The seller starts getting worried. There's a balance here in these deals to be made. So you need to make sure that you're working diligently, efficiently, and quickly. 30 days, maybe up to 45 days to get financing. Once we get that letter and include it in the board application, the board application goes to the property manager. They review it, come back with any feedback, then it finally goes to the board for their review. That can take up to another 30 days. They don't have necessarily a timeline to review it, and boards operate at different paces. Some are super fast. They'll look at something and have a decision next day in terms of granting you an interview. Others will take weeks. Some boards only meet once a month. And if you miss that day after you've submitted, your application just the day after the meeting, you have to wait until the next month. So this is why this whole process for a co-op can take up to 2 to 3 months, sometimes even longer. So you must be prepared for that. So once we've submitted the board application, this then hopefully is so buttoned up with a little bow on top of it that the board has no questions. They look at everything and they approve the application and grant an interview. Now, this is the part that people hear horror stories about and are very concerned about in coming into the process. However, everyone must go through an interview, unless you're buying something like a sponsor apartment where it's just buying directly from the sponsor and has nothing to do with the board. But in the normal co-op buying process, you are going to have an interview. These interviews can take on any form because, again, you're dealing with different buildings who have different boards who run different processes. Sometimes even when I have done a deal in a building and I understand what the board may have asked for in the interview or how they conducted an interview, boards get new people on them all the time. There are elections usually every year. There may be new people who may be running new processes and approach interviews in a different way. So you must be prepared. A really good agent is going to help walk you through the standard kind of questions that are usually asked in a board interview. Sometimes for me, clients have come back and said, well, it really wasn't much of an interview. It was, just more about the house rules and what it's like living in the building and those expectations. Other people have had very extensive questioning of their financials and their applications. So you need to be prepared for most anything, but a really good agent can prepare you for just about any scenario. What the interview is not is a welcome to our building and here's some milk and cookies and we're rolling out the red carpet. I think that that's what many buyers think is going to happen in this interview. This is more like a job interview, a serious interview to make sure that you are going to be a financially secure and responsible shareholder coming into the organization. So it's serious, it's often very professional, almost verging on cold, but usually kind, but it's much more like a job interview. They are looking to see if you're going to be a really great shareholder coming into their company. It's important to understand that because each co-op is a privately owned company with a board, that the boards can make a decision and reject an application and not have to give any reason why. It's a private company. They can do basically whatever they want to. Now, does that open up to some fair housing issues and some discrimination issues? Of course it does. It is an imperfect process. But again, with our inventory being about 85% co-ops are bought and sold every day. So the horror stories that you may hear about that are small in comparison to the sheer amount of successful transactions that go on with boards who act appropriately and very fairly during the transaction. So again, in your search process and in your criteria process, if you've taken care of that all up front, chances are you're going to have a good, solid board application and a good, solid interview process and get approved for your New York City dream home. So as you can see, this is a very long process. It takes a while to even explain the process, right? And it can be completely overwhelming. This is why it is very, very important for you to work with someone that is on your side. And I'm talking about a buyer's agent here. I know a lot of people think, I don't need a buyer's agent. And I understand that. But in New York City, buyer's agents are much different than buyer's agents out in the rest of the world. They are really, a good one is really going to hold your hand through this entire process, explain everything, and be there right by your side and help you through every step of the way to mitigate any risks and to help the transaction go smoothly. So it's important for you to work with someone who is really, really great at this process and help you get your New York City dream home with as smooth of a transaction as possible. All right, so there you have it. Those are the steps involved in buying a co-op in New York City. Again, I'm Dewey Moss. I'm your New York City real estate resource. I would love to be the one to help you find your dream home and help you through this co-op process. Take a look below for all the different ways you can get in touch with me. Do me a favor, like, subscribe, and hit that notification button.